The problem of the state is evidently as far from solution as ever. Thanks, guys. Today is a bit of a new style kind of rally. We're not demanding anything of anybody else except ourselves. It's upon ourselves to take the knowledge and information that we have to make that change possible and actually execute for a better future. So this is the Rally for Peace and Prosperity, but I'm kind of an anti sort of guy, so my talk is going to be about violence and bankruptcy. This is the situation that we're in now. Now, lots of Austrian economists, beginning with Ludwig von Mises and on through, have shown that the business cycle, as they call it, is caused by the central bank's intervention in the economy, their creation of new money, the artificial lowering of interest rates with police power to make it seem like there are more savings in the economy, so that people invest in projects that turns out are unsustainable projects. There wasn't enough capital to get them all started, so we have the boom, we have the bust. And I think that's really the best name for the business cycle, is the boom and bust cycle, because it's really all about war. That boom is the shock and awe, tearing human lives apart in other people's countries. And then the bust is the economic pain that we suffer. Obviously, you know, one could just think about it and draw some conclusions from just the last 10 years in this country and what we're going through with our economy right now. But I'd like to go back through a couple of examples from history, the world wars, Vietnam, the first Gulf War, to illustrate my point. The Central Banking Act, the Federal Reserve Act, was passed at the end of 1913. The Federal Reserve was established in 1914. Most people tend to think of the Federal Reserve as some kind of New Deal reform from the 1930s, but in fact, it had predated the New Deal by 20 years and was in fact the cause of the Great Depression that the New Deal supposedly was the solution for in the 1930s. The central bank, as I said, took form in 1914, and the next year, Colonel Edward Mandell House, who was Woodrow Wilson's closest advisor, Wilson's Cheney, he's been called, the next year he went to England and secretly negotiated American entry into World War I, 2 years before it actually took place. And in order to pay for America's involvement in World War I, which began in 1917, of course, they went to the Federal Reserve to create the money out of thin air. If they'd raised the taxes on the American people in order to pay for a war to go save the French and the British, the American people would have balked. Instead, they made it look like it was cheap. And the consequences came later, the consequences being the Panic of 1920 and 21, after the end of the First World War. And now, at the time, the president was Harding, and he had a Treasury Secretary named Andrew Mellon, who prescribed that they do nothing to solve the problem of this panic. And nothing they did, and the panic was over in just a couple of years, which is why almost no one has ever even heard of the Great Depression of 1920 through 21. It was over by 22, and growth had started again. And of course, in the 20s, there are all kinds of new technologies and new expansions of the American economy in all different ways. But what we call the Roaring 20s didn't really get going until 1927. And they had had a pretty easy money policy throughout the 1920s. But in 1927, Benjamin Strong, who was the chairman of the American Federal Reserve Board, did a favor for his mentor, Montague Norman, the chairman of the Bank of England. And because they were having their own troubles, he decided to pay for their wars. He decided to devalue the American currency in order to prop up the British pound. To do so, he created a ton of money out of nothing, lowered the interest rates, and created the giant stock market bubble that we all know of that popped in October of 1929. Now, without getting all the way into the New Deal reforms and Herbert Hoover's role, I urge everybody to read Murray Rothbard, America's Great Depression, and you can see that all Roosevelt did was continue the policies that Hoover had already started, even though they try to pretend that President Herbert Hoover was some kind of Ron Paul, laissez-faire, free market guy. He was actually a Northeastern progressive and initiated the New Deal. But the way we all learn it in school is that the New Deal did a lot to help us, but then it was really World War II that saved us from the Great Depression. Now, if the New Deal was such a great thing, you might wonder why in 1941 the Great Depression was still going on. But, you know, I don't know. For some reason that seems to fly. Anyway, so once World War II got started, or American intervention in World War II got started at the end of 1941, they conscripted 16 million people and exported them to other people's countries to go and fight for freedom. That did wonders for the unemployment rate. And now look at all the new opportunities for women. Don't you want to go put rivets into tanks and airplanes to help kill people in foreign countries? It's very empowering. And so anyway, what they teach us, though, is that the New Deal worked well, but it was World War II that really saved us from the Great Depression as it ramped up all that industry and so forth. But as Robert Higgs has shown in his book, Depression, War, and Cold War, the government simply fiddled with the numbers. They took all their deficit spending on war materials and then counted that as the GDP and said, oh, look at how great all this war spending has been for the economy. In fact, the Great Depression lasted all the way through World War II until it was over and the guys came home and were able to, and because of all the rations and restrictions on the economy in the country during World War II, they finally went ahead and got to rock bottom in that Great Depression that they'd been trying to prevent with all that stimulus. When the guys came home from World War II, they were able to take all those new factories that had been built to make the war machines and so forth and turn their swords into plowshares. And so the economy was finally able to get going again. Also, of course, at the end of World War II, the entire world had burned to the ground. America was the only industrial power left standing, and so anybody who needed anything on Earth needed to import it from America. And so, you know, that was a very unique situation that is different and it's certainly not applicable to the common theme that, well, war is good for the economy, which is what they try to teach us. Now, the specifics of the 1950s and the Korean War I'm not as good on, and also most people don't know much about it anyway, but I know that you guys can relate to the history of Vietnam. That you know, if it's not you, it's at least your parents, your uncles and aunts who lived through that time, who can explain that era. And of course, Lyndon Johnson was not just the world's worst warmonger responsible for the deaths of millions of people, but he also was a socialist who pushed all of his Great Society programs. Now, in order to pay for that war and all that socialist spending, they had to turn on the money machines. And they created a giant bubble which popped in 1968. For 10 years after 1968, the Johnson and the Nixon and Ford administrations inflated and inflated. They spent deficit spending to stimulate the economy, to try to prop up the economy to the bubble levels from the 1960s instead of letting the correction take hold. And what happened, of course, is what we call stagflation, which all the prominent economists at the time said was impossible, that you would have a high inflation rate and a high unemployment rate. Well, that's what we had. A bunch of people out of work with prices going through the roof every day on their store shelves. And eventually this led to Nixon putting on wage and price controls, like some nightmare out of the old world, which of course led to shortages and was a terrible catastrophe. Well, finally, at the end of the 1970s, Paul Volcker was brought in to become the chairman of the Fed. And he decided that they were going to abandon the program of stimulating, abandon the program of deficit spending. They were going to jack the interest rates through the roof and force the correction, put the economy in a stranglehold, and liquidate all the bad debts and some good ones too. Get the American, the price system back to its natural level, maybe even a little bit below. And you probably, perhaps some of y'all remember that at the beginning of Reagan's first term, everybody hated his guts. Somehow he was reelected with 49 out of 50 states in 1984. Why? Because the recession was over. They finally began lowering the interest rates again and let the economy get back going on its feet. Still, the people were suffering in 1982, 83 from the war in Vietnam from 15 years before. Another one that's a pretty common example that you guys can remember from your own experience was the first Gulf War in 1991. Bill Clinton ran and beat George Bush handily with the slogan, "It's the economy, stupid." Well, what was wrong with the economy? Well, they just created a bunch of money out of thin air to pay for a war against Iraq. And then the bubble had crashed. They needed time to let the prices settle back down before they could get a good start again. And because it was bad times, Bill Clinton could easily just say, "Are you better off than 4 years ago? Of course you're not. Elect me instead." And so he won. Still, the connection wasn't being made in public anywhere between we just spent all this money killing Iraqis and now we're all broke. Because, of course, we all learn in school that war is good for the economy, like World War II. And so how could it be that the one thing causes the other? Now, the greatest example, of course, is our contemporary experience with the war on terrorism. When George W. Bush took office, he very rightfully said, "Hey, this recession was already here. This is the Clinton recession. I just got here. This isn't my fault. I want everybody to remember." He was absolutely right about that. Bill Clinton had had his own giant bubble, the dot-com bubble in the stock market, etc., because the American people wanted their peace dividend after the Cold War, and the only way they could deny it to us and continue to expand the empire around the world was to make it all seem like it was free. Who needs a peace dividend when we're all making money anyway? Let them build bases in Kyrgyzstan or wherever they want. So that was Bill Clinton's bubble, and it had popped. When George W. Bush came into power, he was in the middle of a recession. Then September 11th hit, and not only did September 11th hit, it hit downtown Manhattan. So here the United States was due, for a severe recession. The airlines were hit, the financial systems were impacted severely, and instead of letting that recession take hold, these Republicans wanted to have a war. They couldn't have the American people out of work complaining about how they can't put food on their family, as George Bush likes to say, while they're waging one war in Afghanistan and trying to start another one in Iraq. They had to make it seem free. And in fact, not only did they make it seem free, they said the oil will pay for it. Whatever oil we take out of the ground in Iraq will pay for all the invasion and the reconstruction and everything. That's what Paul Wolfowitz and Donald Rumsfeld said. And to prove it to you, they sent you checks in the mail for $300. Not only are we not raising your taxes, we're giving you stimulus money. You're going to get, everyone who pays income taxes is going to get $300. Look at how much money we're making off of this war. And for the entire first decade or almost the entire first decade of this century, reasonable people were wondering, if the government is spending so much money killing people all over the world, expanding Medicare Part D and all these other big government programs that George Bush did, he didn't do anything to repeal anything from the Clinton era. How come everybody's so prosperous with all this spending, all this wartime? Well, it was because the Federal Reserve had turned the money machine on full blast. They had lowered interest rates through the floor, and they were pouring money into the economy. So people were saying, well, geez, maybe I should be broke, but then again, I just refinanced my house and got a check for $20,000. I think I'm going to do it again in a year. And so the illusion was there that not only is war good for the economy, apparently it's really good for the economy. Until the crash comes. And that's the whole thing about economics, is you can have police power and you can have a money machine and you can manipulate things with your bubble gum and strings and your smoke and your wires, but ultimately it's no different than the laws of physics. And the laws of economics will come due. And that's what we're suffering through now, is the crash of September 2008. And of course, all that they can conceive of to do there in Washington, D.C. is to continue to lower interest rates, keep them at near zero, to continue to print money full blast in order to bail out all the rich, to try to keep unemployment below at least 10%, the way they count it, 10%. It's really more like a fifth of the American people out of work right now. But it could be worse. We could have a worse recession that's over quicker, but they don't want that, because if the recession is really bad, we might just say, you know what? Let's stop killing Afghans. We're spending too much money killing Afghans. We're spending too much money killing people in Yemen and in Somalia and in Pakistan and in Iraq, where 50,000 combat troops are still stationed. And so maybe we need to just abolish the empire and take care of ourselves. They don't want us coming to conclusions like that. So they want to keep stimulating and keep stimulating. And as local jurisdictions across this country are making decisions like how many months of school, how many extra months of summer should the kids have at school? How many teachers are we laying off? How many roads can we afford to continue paving? And this is really happening. These are debates that are happening at municipal utility districts and county court levels all over this society right now. We can't afford to pave the roads. We can't afford to keep the schools open. And at the same time that this is going on, the warlords of Washington continue to expand the empire around the world. They are not happy hiring the Ethiopians to go and murder Somalis. They want the American Army and the American Marine Corps in Somalia murdering them firsthand and on your dime. And if it comes down to it, the people who rule this country will cannibalize every last bit of wealth and property we have in order to keep their Pentagon. And the real danger is, at this point, because of all the propaganda that we suffer from the time we're little kids, the vast majority of the American people really agree with us about the U.S. state. They don't trust Washington, D.C. at all. But what do they trust? The Pentagon. Who do they trust? General Petraeus. Now there's a man who knows how to get things done, I heard on TV. And there's a man who, if you ask Sarah Palin, there's a guy who knows how to command things. We don't need a lawyer up at a lectern. We need a commander issuing commands from wherever they issue commands from. And as we risk, now you hear Ron Paul, and there other speakers will probably be addressing this later in the day. You hear Ron Paul and the other prominent Austrian economists talking about their fear that the last bubble is the bond market, that the investments that people have made in American securities, that bubble could finally break, that all those dollars could come flying back here, and we could be spending $100 bills like dimes. That's the kind of danger that they're playing with all this inflation, costing the dollar its reserve status over the world. And you could see real chaos in this society if the dollar breaks the way that people like Ron Paul are predicting it will. And so then I think the real question is, what do we do? What do we believe anymore? When the real crisis comes, are we going to turn to General Petraeus to bring the army out, to bring us bottles of water and food and keep us safe? Or are we going to recognize that we made our wrong decision back generations ago when we decided on this world empire? That it's not the American way that's failed, it's our abandonment of the American way that's failed. It's acting like the empires of the old world that's destroying us. And can we recognize that all we have to do is embrace the principles that we all assent to, whether libertarians, left, right, or anybody else, the principles of the Declaration of Independence, the principles of the American Bill of Rights. If we can believe in those principles, maintain our belief in those principles, then we can come out of this okay. The danger is that we will turn once again to the government to solve the problem that it has created for us. So, in closing, stop believing in them, because all they ever say to you is lies anyway. And usually the lies that they're telling are with purpose. They need you to believe the lies so that they can get away with doing horrible things to you. And so it seems like maybe we could just stop believing them. If the last 500,000 things any politician ever said within your earshot wasn't true, maybe that's a clue that the next couple of million things out of their mouths will also be a deception. So that's really all I have to say. Stop believing in the legitimacy of the U.S. state. It's responsible for destroying our society. Thank you.